Welcome to the podcast series The New Student Pharmacist, where we discuss chemistry and pharmacy, as well as leaders in pharmacy careers, community, and chemistry and pharmacy research. We encourage you to support the work we are doing and follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts by subscribing for free. Note, the views on the podcast represent those of my guest and I.
Purpose of these episodes not at all for advice or medical suggestions. These are aimed to provide support to peer pharmacists in training in educational and intellectually stimulating ways. Again, these are not at all for medical advice or medical suggestions. Please see your local board and state-certified health professional. The views of this podcast represent those of my guests and I.
Alright, let's talk about a general method to tackle complex pharmacokinetic problems. We'll walk through a step-by-step approach, making sure each part makes sense as we go. First, it's important to identify patient-specific parameters. These include the ideal body weight, or IBW, the adjusted body weight for obese patients, known as ABW, creatinine clearance, or CRCL, the volume of distribution, which we call VD, and finally, clearance, or CL. Next, you'll want to calculate key pharmacokinetic parameters. The elimination rate constant, K, is calculated as clearance divided by volume of distribution, or CL over VD. The half-life, T1/2, is found by dividing 0.693 by K. Now for some tips on dosing gentamicin or tobramycin. To begin the pharmacokinetic dosing process, first calculate the patient's ideal body weight. If the patient is significantly overweight, meaning more than 120% of their ideal body weight, you'll need to calculate their adjusted body weight. Next, determine the patient's creatinine clearance using the Cockcroft-Gault equation to evaluate renal function. After assessing renal function, calculate the drug's volume of distribution, typically starting with a baseline of 0.25 liters per kilogram multiplied by IBW, and add 0.1 liters per kilogram for any excess body weight if needed. With the estimated creatinine clearance, calculate the gentamicin or tobramycin clearance by multiplying 0.06 by the creatinine clearance. Use the clearance and volume of distribution values to calculate the elimination rate constant, which is clearance divided by volume of distribution, and then derive the half-life by dividing 0.693 by K. Using the target peak concentration and volume of distribution, calculate an initial dose. After the patient reaches steady state, make sure to measure actual peak and trough levels. Finally, adjust the dosage or dosing interval as needed, using pharmacokinetic equations to meet the desired therapeutic peak and trough targets. Alright, so to begin dosing vancomycin, you'll want to first estimate the patient's creatinine clearance using the Cockcroft-Gault equation. After that, calculate the patient's specific vancomycin clearance with the formula clearance equals 0.689 times creatinine clearance plus 3.66. Next, determine the volume of distribution, which is usually 0.7 liters per kilogram multiplied by the total body weight. With these parameters, you can calculate the elimination rate constant, which is clearance divided by volume of distribution, and then figure out the drug's half-life using 0.693 divided by that rate constant. Use the desired steady-state trough concentration to calculate an appropriate initial vancomycin dosing regimen, applying the pharmacokinetic dosing equation that involves the dosing interval, target concentration, and elimination rate constant. Once the patient reaches steady state, you'll need to measure actual trough concentrations. Based on these measured trough levels, or the desired AUC to MIC ratios, adjust the dosage or dosing intervals to make sure you're hitting that therapeutic efficacy and safety. For digoxin dosing, you'll want to first estimate the patient's creatinine clearance using the Cockcroft-Gault equation to determine renal clearance. Based on renal function, calculate the digoxin clearance. Next, estimate the volume of distribution, which is commonly around 7 liters per kilogram. But keep in mind, this might vary a bit based on patient characteristics. Use these values to calculate the appropriate initial loading dose, using the formula loading dose equals desired concentration times volume of distribution, divided by bioavailability. After that, calculate the maintenance dose by applying the clearance, desired steady-state concentration, dosing interval, and bioavailability. At steady state, measure the digoxin concentration in plasma, and then adjust maintenance doses as needed to achieve and maintain therapeutic concentration ranges, which really helps minimize the risk of toxicity. For procainamide and its active metabolite N-acetylprocainamide, or NAPA, start by calculating the patient's creatinine clearance using the Cockcroft-Gault formula, since evaluating renal function is essential for both drugs. Use creatinine clearance to calculate procainamide and NAPA clearance, making sure to account for both renal and hepatic components as needed. Next, estimate the volume of distribution for procainamide, which is generally around 2 liters per kilogram. Calculate the appropriate intravenous loading dose to achieve your desired therapeutic concentrations, using the formula loading dose equals target concentration times volume of distribution. Then, determine the appropriate maintenance infusion rate using procainamide clearance and the desired steady-state concentration, with the formula infusion rate equals clearance times desired concentration. At steady state, measure both procainamide and NAPA plasma concentrations, and then adjust dosing or infusion rates based on these concentrations to achieve therapeutic effectiveness while avoiding toxicity. When dosing methotrexate, begin by estimating the patient's creatinine clearance using the Cockcroft-Gault equation, which will help guide your renal clearance estimates. From population estimates or any patient-specific data you might have, calculate methotrexate clearance. Using the target methotrexate plasma concentration, determine the necessary infusion rate with the relationship infusion rate equals target steady-state concentration times clearance. After administration, you'll want to regularly measure methotrexate plasma levels at predetermined intervals. Based on these plasma concentrations, make any necessary adjustments, including modifying dosing schedules or adding or adjusting leucovorin rescue therapy to effectively manage therapeutic goals and prevent adverse toxicity associated with methotrexate. To approach lithium pharmacokinetics, start by assessing the patient's renal function, usually by calculating creatinine clearance with the Cockcroft-Gault equation. Renal clearance has a direct impact on lithium clearance, since lithium is primarily eliminated unchanged by the kidneys. Estimate lithium clearance using the relationship based on renal function, which is often approximated as lithium clearance equals 0.25 times creatinine clearance. Determine the appropriate volume of distribution for lithium, which is usually around 0.7 liters per kilogram based on the patient's total body weight. With these parameters, calculate the elimination rate constant, which is clearance divided by volume of distribution, and then the half-life, which is 0.693 divided by the elimination rate constant. Calculate the initial lithium dose needed to achieve your desired steady-state concentration using standard pharmacokinetic dosing equations. Dose equals target concentration times clearance times dosing interval. After starting therapy, measure serum lithium levels at steady state, which usually happens about 4 to 5 half-lives after initiation or any dosage adjustment. Based on these measured serum levels, carefully adjust lithium doses or dosing intervals, taking into account factors like changes in renal function, drug interactions, patient hydration status, and toxicity risk to maintain therapeutic concentrations, typically ranging from 0.6 to 1.2 milliequivalents per liter.
Purpose of these episodes not at all for advice or medical suggestions. These are aimed to provide support to peer pharmacists in training in educational and intellectually stimulating ways. Again, these are not at all for medical advice or medical suggestions. Please see your local board and state-certified health professional. The views of this podcast represent those of my guests and I.
Thanks for listening. We're glad you were able to tune into this podcast. Once again, this is the New Chemist, where we discuss chemistry, which simply put is the science of change, as well as the other sciences, careers, community, research, and COVID-19. Thanks again for listening. Note, the views on this podcast represent those of my guests and I.
Yeah. Oh.
Okay, so welcome to the New Chemist podcast. This is definitely a treat to have again with me Mike Zott. Today, just before we get started, the New Chemist podcast is a podcast about chemistry, the science of change. We discuss scientific concepts, scientific careers, research, and a variety of other aspects of progress in science. We've interviewed several key pioneers in the field from MIT, Harvard, Caltech, Georgia Tech, and a variety of other places. Today we're going to have a different take on the interview. One of my good colleagues and friends, Mike, Dr. Zott, postdoc at UPenn, is actually going to interview me. So I am highly honored and humbled by the fact that my buddy decided to interview me and chose to interview me. So take it away, Mike.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for being willing to do this, David. I'm excited to flip the table on this podcast because, I've been a guest before, and
Twice.
I think that was really cool. Yeah, twice actually.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people who might be listening to the podcast might be curious to hear some more about you in the format of the podcast, since obviously they like the podcast already.
Okay. This is good. So go ahead, Mike, take it away.
Okay. Well, I know that you've, discussed this, in bits and pieces throughout the long storied history of this podcast. But what I'm interested in is kind of like a brief, succinct recap of what got you into starting the New Chemist podcast. Like, how did you come up with the idea? And then how have you kind of iterated on that through now? Because I think, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's been over 5 years at least, the podcast. So definitely things have changed with time.
Yes, things have changed. So the reason why I started this podcast, it goes all the way back to, during the pandemic in 2020, having the scientific connections and network that I had and friends I had in science, and wanting to reconnect, as well as I read this book by MIT Press, Find Your Path. And their whole take on analyzing, if that's the right word, or reflecting or looking closely at the careers of different scientists. I was fascinated by that approach, and I thought, it would be cool to take that approach and make it, if you will, in living color, or make it practical. At the same time, I have always been someone who's always been interested in helping people, and I saw that this as a practical avenue to not only reach forward but also reach back, and basically connect people with the people I was connected to by extension or by way of the conversation. So this is very meaningful experience I've had, and I'm grateful that I've had the opportunity to have it.
Okay, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. A lot of people were trying new things when the pandemic was happening, but I think well, I'll get into a few things. I think one of the things I find most impressive is just the longevity of it, because as you might be aware, a lot of people started doing things like, I don't know, baking sourdough bread during COVID, and then they've fallen off from that. But you're still very much, continuing to stick with it, continuing to get really cool guests on the podcast. And I think it's really impressive that you've, kept it going this far.
Yeah,
Do you have any, yeah, do you have any thoughts? I guess we'll look backwards and then we'll also look forwards. So looking backwards, what do you think's been the biggest success of the series so far?
I think this conversation right now, being able to have people like you who are interested in continuing the progress of the podcast, and not just you. I've also had Dr. Langa on the podcast at least about 3 times. So Bob has been on the podcast 3 times. I think the biggest success has been the I'd say I'll put it in like different categories. Professionally, it's been the reach of the podcast in different countries, the metrics has been refreshing to see. But beyond that, it's been the strengthening of the relationships that I've had with these people, and also people benefiting from listening to it, either my colleagues who I see on a daily basis at school, or even, just having the opportunity to engage in conversations. The biggest success, to make it short, biggest success has been the metrics as well as the people. Like having people who are still interested in having these conversations outside of our personal rapport. I think this is a good sign. Good sign of progress, of success, if you want to phrase it. As well as one more thing I like to add. Another aspect of the success has been like the podcast has almost been like a milestone for some of these people. Like I can think of one of the persons who I've interviewed who's like a colleague in the science communication space, Simar Bajaj. He has done tremendously well. I interviewed him, I think, in 2023, and he's gone on to win some of the most amazing awards. To see the progress of these people, and then Dr. Emian Brown from Harvard, see him be inducted into other societies, and just to see the future successes of the guests, that in itself has been a form of success. But it speaks to the caliber of the podcast and the caliber of the guests.
Yeah, that brings me into like another question I've had. How do you get not only do you get people who are of a very high caliber within, we'll say, the name of the podcast, it's related to chemistry. You have really successful people in the field of chemistry, but you also have people coming from the sports world. You have people coming from biotechnology. You have people coming from
Music.
newspaper reporters. You have people coming from music. Like, how do you have A, such a broad network, and B, how do you go about? I imagine some of these people you're approaching for the first time about the podcast, and then you're also in some ways relying on the network you already have. So just talk about the network you already have, and also how you go about expanding that network.
So it's interesting you bring that up. So network. I'll tell you a story. While I was a judge at Tech, there was a seminar taking place. I forgot the name of the building. I think it's on Peach Street. It was one of the lecture halls that Georgia Tech had around that area. I think it was a little bit raised down to really. Went to a seminar. I was actually late to the seminar, by the way. Who knows what would have happened if I was there early? But I was late to the seminar, so I stayed to the end. And this seminar speaker, his name was Dr. Emery N. Brown. I had the good opportunity to learn about him and his work through Dr. Bellam Konda, inviting him to Georgia Tech to begin with for the seminar, and then also being able to sit and listen to the work that he was doing in anesthesia and how statistics was involved that work. So fast forward to 2021, I emailed him, reminded him of the story, and then also I invited him to be on the podcast through those types of experiences. So it's the formative experiences that I've had in my academic journey, considering how I've been on this journey for a minute. with my this these training programs, healthcare and also in chemistry. So that, as well as it's almost as if it's like a catalyst. I'm trying to remember the it's almost like autocatalytic induction. If you, I think I'm using the correct phrase in that one catalyst leads to another thing being catalyzed, another thing leads to another thing being catalyzed. So, for example, with my network, I've had people from my network recommend the podcast to other people. Like one of the persons who I interviewed from MIT recommended the podcast to someone from the Wall Street Journal. That's how I ended up having that guest from the Wall Street Journal on the podcast. And then some people reach out to me, like at least about 10 people have reached out to me recent, wanting to be on the podcast. But I have to schedule the time for them, but it's a matter of coordinating times and schedules and things like that. So the network leads to more people being added to the network. Then also there are people who basically serve as a liaison, who when they see the potential of podcasts, they then basically find guests for you. So sometimes they basically connect you with other guests and see if you're interested in having them on your podcast based on the brand connection and also the work that you're doing. So network basically expands itself, especially when you do things from a place of authenticity. I think when you do things from a place of authenticity and you also recognize that, I have to say this, God is at work, you're able to progress in your field and in your vocation, and you're able to really make an impact. And I think it all comes together, it works itself out. Initially, when I started this podcast, took a good bit of work, but eventually I found a rhythm, I found a flow, I found like the criteria that I was using to make sure that the podcast brand in itself didn't get lost in aspirations. Podcast was able to really become solidified as an avenue for people, because like I said at the top of this conversation, I've always wanted to help people in ways that will help not just them but also to me, ways that I think of me. So I think that has contributed to me being able to expand the network. And yeah, man, it's really been, like I said, a good experience.
Yeah, I think it's been a good experience for me. I've loved participating in it. Also listening to other people's, interviews with you. So I think I really like the point you touched on, doing things authentically. People are going to respond to that well. And yeah, that's exactly what's happened. I think one of the points you've also touched on several times is that one of your motivations is trying to help people. And one of the ways I see that borne out in your podcast, apart from the great breadth of different speakers that you get onto the podcast, is that you have a really big initiative to make the podcasts available in multiple languages, and you also are playing with different like multimedia elements. So I know you've been looking towards like the music video type approach. What are some of these like new ways you're trying to make the podcast more accessible to a wider range of people, and kind of where did you get those ideas?
Okay, sure. So, my thing is, I want to be able to help people in a way that's tangible and meaningful. And how can I help someone if I'm speaking or telling or interviewing someone in English and their main or their mother tongue is French, or their mother tongue is Portuguese, or their mother tongue is Pashto, or their mother tongue might be Spanish? How can I reach them? So I was like, okay, let me transcribe the interviews, and then with the assistance of software, and also checking it as it's transcribing and as it's being recorded, checking the translation by translating it back. I was like, let me translate these podcasts and make them. So I translated the interviews with Dr. Golub. He's a professor from the Broad Institute. Also, he's a professor of pediatrics at Harvard and Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. And also Dr. Emian Brown. Dr. Langer's interview, I think I've translated into at least about 7 languages. I even made an attempt to try and translate Golub, Langer, Brown, and I have to double check and see who else. But a number of the interviews are translated into different languages. That idea comes about because, I think about what are the barriers to creating access. Even like there are even some programs where you can translate it once you transcribe it into sign language. Because they have a lot of AI programs that allow you to translate into ASL, so American Sign Language. Um, I'm like, what are the barriers to creating access for a person? I think about those barriers. One, the barriers could be linguistic. The barriers could be cost. The podcast is free, and even an initiative I made was given that there were so many cuts with internships. I was like, how can I take the podcast? In the Christian faith, we talk about what is in your hand. There's a passage of scripture talks about when God spoke to him, he asked him, what is in your hand? So, in a similar manner, what do I have in my hand that's able that I can multiply or I can use to help other people? And the podcast, which is a repository of about 200 plus episodes in multiple languages with multiple levels or layers of content, took that and I created like a website in which people can basically find they could basically find their path in science communication through. I'll probably post the link. I have the link to the website in the podcast description, but people can basically find their path in science communication through the different episodes. Then they can write something at the end of it. It's almost like a virtual internship experience, and then they could send it to me, and I'll send them some feedback based on it. But yeah, man, it's all centered around this idea of expanding access. I interviewed Dr. Bayer from Georgia Tech. He was someone who I also got the opportunity to meet through one of the research experiences there, and he's basically like a mentor of mine. And one of the things he talked about in our conversation on the podcast in like 2021, one of the things we talked about was building your voice. And the way you do that, he said this exactly, the way you do that is by being exceptional, by being good at what you do, so that you can speak to people who are senior and make an impact. Because the moment you build a voice, you build it with momentum and consistency, like we spoke about authenticity, you have the capacity to make change. Because not only will you have the credibility to make that change, but you have the track record to make sure the change is long lasting. So it's all about, trying to make an impact, trying to remove barriers for access for other people so that people are able to not only access it, but earn in that space. So cut their teeth basically in the space, learn a new skill or learn a new gain a new mindset, a new way of thinking about things. I'm recognizing that impact is important. It's not really about being impressive, but making an impact, doing things that are transformative and not really incremental, but more transformative. That was a concept that Dr. Golub really talked about. Then, making a large impact. That was something that Dr. Langer spoke about. And one of the things that always stands out to me about Bob is that he talks about being persistent, how he persisted past the grant rejections, persisted past the challenges he had with gaining progress in his academic career as a budding professor. And now look at him. And he said, this is something, sometimes in the process of doing these interviews, and sometimes I still do this, you're so focused on getting the interview done successfully and effectively that you're not really digesting everything that the person is saying. For example, the interview with Dr. Langer, I've listened to that interview at least about 10 times. And not really to hear myself, but really to hear what was he saying and how could I really digest it. So one of the things he talked about was, he tells the students that he can now look at them and tell them when they're encountering challenges, if you can overcome this, imagine the level of success you can have in the future. Because he's not just saying that from abstraction, from a place of a theoretical place. He's saying that from his real, concrete, lived experience. And I think that in itself is powerful. Then also, I was listening to the conversation with Simar Bajaj. I've probably listened to that at least about 20 times. At least 20 times. Because the level of, and as someone who's similar to me in terms of age, went to Harvard, He's a Marshall Scholar, written for the BMJ, the Lancet, Nature, bunch of other press outlets, The Guardian, won the AAAS Carvey Award for journalism. He's just blazing a trail, and I think he's like in his early 20s. And the reason why I listened to that so many times is because he made so many good points. One of the points he made was, being hard on the issues, being hard on the problems, but not being hard on yourself. I think that's something at two is a good point to take away. That as you pursue your goal, as you work towards achieving excellence, as you grow in your field, recognize that the issues, the problems, the circumstances, the avenues or ways you want to improve, those are the things you really dive deep on or double down on, but still give yourself grace, still give yourself, another way to say this is, still give yourself room to grow or room to improve and be okay with that. Be okay to be yourself. Be true to who you are so that people can understand and appreciate, even learn from you. Again, going back to that point of authenticity. Yeah, dude. Yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
Okay, I think I'm interested in transitioning a bit more towards away from the podcast and more towards you just for a little bit.
Okay, sure.
And one of the things you mentioned is the ability to gain skills, and mentioning like Bob Langer talking about like pushing through challenges and how that's going to give you the confidence to face new challenges in your future. Do you have like a new skill you're trying to pick up now? Is there a new like niche in the podcast that you're trying to work on where you're really trying to learn a new skill to give you a new direction, or is the gaining of new skills, is that more in the domain of you pursuing your PharmD degree and you're mostly thinking about skills in that context?
I would say that question can be answered. I'd say one for the podcast and then one for the podcast doing right now. So of course, with the degree I'm pursuing right now, every day I step into the classroom is an effort to gain new skills. Yeah, because right now I'm learning about infectious disease and gamut of gram positive to gram negative to antibiotic coverage to different types of respiratory tract infections, skin and soft tissue infections, to bacterial bloodborne infections, to different types of treatments for sepsis, to fungal infections, to viral infections, to hepatitis, opportunistic infections, non-HIV infections, parasitic infections. So that whole wheelhouse, and learning how to do that well, something I'm still working on. So that's a whole array of skills that I'm still working on. At the same time, with the podcast, I would say the new skill for me that I'm trying to gain the podcast is really I think it's like bimodal, or it's like two-pronged, in that at the same time as I progress to the podcast and a lot of people reach out to me, new skill for me right now is making sure that I find people who tie into the value proposition. Doing the skill for me right now with the podcast is doing this thing well, and that this is referring to finding people that tie into the value proposition and that still have a good enough record to the point where the audience will be engaged, metrics will reflect that. So really doing this podcasting thing better than I've done before. So I've done it good in the past, leveling up on that. That in itself is a task, requires a new development of skills. So that's the next skill on new skills for the podcast. But where I spend most of my time, where I'm trying to cut my teeth the most, of course, in my PharmD training. I think that in itself will add a new level of depth to how I go about doing this science communication, aka the podcast.
Yeah. So looking forward, you're, about halfway through your PharmD. Do you
You got it,
have
bro. You
any
got it.
internship do you have any internship things you're trying to get access to? Or are you trying to work on some research things? What are you, I feel like about halfway through, at least when I look back on my PhD and then also looking at how other people do their PhDs in chemistry, usually around the halfway point is a very reflective moment where you want to say, I've gotten to this point, I'm doing well, but I only have a few years left. I've got to really focus myself on this particular thing. That way I can be sure that I get this particular aspect out of my PhD or PharmD. So I guess what are you trying to focus yourself on now? Is it trying to work on the science communication aspect? Is it trying to excel in research? Is it something else I haven't mentioned?
Yeah, yeah.
How are you framing that for
Focusing?
yourself?
Yeah, that's good. That's a very good question that you asked. So for me right now, yes, I did get an internship, thankfully. God is good. I got an internship at Novartis in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you.
Hopefully it's in the summer. It's
Yes, in the
a
summer.
lot nicer in the summer than the winter,
In the summer.
in my
So,
opinion.
yeah, it's all right, bro. It's all right. So yeah, I have an internship at Novartis in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I'm looking forward to that. Really excited about that. And interestingly enough, many of my colleagues from Howard got internships there too. So that's
Can you
definitely
comment before you go on? Can you comment? Did you use your network to help you get the internship? It's very hard for people to get internships. So do you have any, I don't know, just like short
advice.
advice? Yeah.
So yeah, I can get some comments. I actually had to do several interviews. Send an application. Actually, before the application, I had to go to an information session. And from the information session, I was sent the application. Then I had to send the application, prepare the application, write the essays, draft the essays, write the application, find my resume, and after I refine my resume, submit the application. And after that, I had to wait and receive information back concerning the interviews, schedule the interview. I had several interviews with several different people, and each interview I had to prepare based on the person who was interviewing me. And what I mean by that is not just show up as myself, but also show up having read some of their work, making sure that I was putting my best foot forward. Now I do that for at least 3 or 4, 5 different people. Um, so that was the process to interviewing well. And then after that, I had to wait. I'd follow up with them, send them a few emails. So network is good, but in this space or for this instance, it was really work ethic, plus God's grace, and being persistent and making sure I expressed my interest and put my best foot forward for each interview. But yeah, it network probably helped in ways that I can't see right now. But right now, the benefit for me probably from network was indirect in that network taught me how to help me develop my work ethic to the point where I could really progress in these interviews and progress in those interviews and progress the application process. So my advice to someone who wants to get an internship is, do the work beforehand. And not just for the interviews. Before you get to interviews, do the work for the application. To this day, I still have my relatives look at some of my essays because it's one thing to think that what you wrote good. It's another thing to have another person give you feedback on what you wrote honestly. I'll share a story with you because I think this is formative for this conversation. When I was applying for pharmacy school, I wrote an essay. And I let my dad read it. My dad's a physician, a certified physician, went to one of the top residencies in the US after he was finished medical school, pediatrics. My dad, I gave my dad the essay. My dad looked at me and said, "Son, this ain't ready. This ain't ready." He said, "I would not let you in." His words were, "I would not let you into my pharmacy school with this essay. You need to improve this." So
Well, it's good to have someone who can give you the tough feedback. Some people are
course,
afraid
bro,
to
of
give the
course.
tough feedback.
Of course, and that was very useful because this is, I kid you not, after finding my essay and having my dad look at it and give me his recommendation as to where I can improve some more and having the final draft really be well written, I got accepted into every single pharmacy school I applied to and interviewed. To the point where I turned down interviews. I got accepted to the top, to the fifth, to a variety of highly ranked pharmacy schools. And then added to that, some of them even offered me financial aid package. So, and I doubt that my essay had nothing to do with it. So, it's definitely formative and good when you can have people who can give you that honest feedback, help you, in a way, keep yourself grounded and also improve, level up on what you're doing. Yeah. I always like
Yeah,
to say,
definitely.
yeah, I always like to say that it's good when you have people around you who are not overly impressed with what you do. And also at the same time, it's good to have people around you who know just what to give you as positive reinforcement. And I mean that in a good way, in that you have friends and colleagues who can give you the support that you need when you need it, and I'm always grateful for.
Yeah. I think one thing I would add to that is what I found really useful in getting feedback on writing and things of that nature is that it's useful if they have like some expertise in the area you're working in. So your
Mhm.
dad being a physician is obviously very helpful. He has like the medical expertise. But correct me if I'm wrong, he has a slightly different perspective than someone who is, a specialist in like the pharmaceutical sciences. They're like they're certainly related domains, but they're slightly, distinct. So he's got enough expertise that he can, read it from a, very well educated perspective. But he
Uh,
has a bit of an outside perspective to where he can make sure that you're not, using all sorts of jargon that someone who's
uh,
not, a
it,
total 100% expert on this very,
uh,
small niche area, only that sort of person would know. So I think it can help, make your writing more applicable to a general audience, which
right.
first reviewing applications, you never know who's going to be reading it.
Exactly. You can't assume that you're going to have some type of expert pharmacotherapist or expert clinical pharmacist practitioner. You have to make sure that your reading is tasteful for a wide audience. And that too is a skill at science communication. Trying to do science communication well also teaches a skill that you develop over time.
Yeah. Okay, well, we got a little sidetracked. I want to get back to Novartis. So, your plan for the summer. Um,
Huh.
yeah, what year? Obviously, I think you can't really say, or maybe you don't even know yet the exact specific thing you'll be working on, but maybe there are a lot of, confidentiality things involved with working in a company. But do you have any clue like which, you know,
Team?
sub area you might be working in, and
Yeah,
how is that going to tie into the rest of your PharmD?
I think I will be working in discovery sciences. So I am like thrilled to the moon, Mike. Why, Mike? I'm so excited. It's almost I feel like it's almost like dream come true. So I'm working in discovery sciences. I don't know what I'll be working on yet in terms of exact project and what that'll look like, but I know how it'll have something to do with pharmacy in terms of drug development or drug discovery, but I don't know what that'll look like yet. I don't know.
Okay. And then once this internship's over, what do you think your, focus will be in the remaining time in your PharmD?
So my focus would be on finishing the modules. So we have modules that we take every semester, two modules. So it would be IT5, IT6, IT7, and IT8. So 5 is cancer, 6 I think is renal, 7 is neuro, and 8 is special population. So for each semester after your first year at Howard University College of Pharmacy, you have modules that you uh, dive into, and you basically get deep dive on what it's like to have an understanding of that aspect of pharmacy. So first module was foundation, the second module was cardiovascular pharmacotherapeutics. So delving deep into things like what is hypertension, what is pulmonary arterial hypertension, what is acute coronary syndrome, how do you treat those different things, what do you give? Do you give ranolazine and a statin, or do you change the dose for those types of things? What do you give for blood pressure? How do you change those doses? Do you not give? What type of ionic abnormalities of blood ionic abnormalities do you watch out for, like hyperkalemia and QTC prolongation? Well, watch out for those things and tossage the points. So those types of things we learned about in the cardiovascular module in IT3. So infectious disease. So the foundations module we learned about like lab tests, how to interpret labs, and you basically got a general overview of all the different modules. For IT3, it's a deep dive into like infectious disease. How do you treat a gram-positive infection? How do you treat a resistant gram-positive infection? So, for instance, for some gram-positives, you use like a penicillin. That ties into some of my chemistry knowledge in that you learn about beta-lactams and the rings and people who did the work to discover those things. How it also ties into the work with like Woodward and Rich came up with the synthesis for cephalosporin C. So we learned about cephalosporins in this module and the different generations and how you have increasing the gram-negative activity for each higher generation of cephalosporin. So from a cephazolin all the way to ceftazidine. And for in the middle you have ceftriaxone, which is a third generation cephalosporin, otherwise known as Rosetta. And then we learn about a variety of different things, how to treat different infections. Then for the next module, it'll be about bone and joint immunology. So the things I'll be focusing in on are really gaining that clinical acumen, because one of the reasons why I took this path to get a PharmD after my master's in chemistry was I wanted to be able to have an avenue to translate what I was learning, not just in the research arena and in the academic arena, but also in the healthcare space, whether it be practicing community pharmacy or practicing hospital pharmacy. What that looks like, I'm not sure yet what the end game will be, but I know for sure will definitely involve, or my goal is to make sure it involves the trifecta: research, teaching, and service in healthcare. So that's kind of where I see myself focusing in to make sure I double down and get the skills that I need, so I'm able to reach for the impactful career that I'm hoping and praying to have.
Okay, so yeah, it sounds like you're still keeping your options open in your exact path, which I think is pretty smart to do, and definitely I think your internship's going to help you define where you want to be going in the future. Geographically, you're from the Bahamas. You're doing your research here in America. Do you have a feeling where you're going to end up country-wise? Maybe even a different country?
I don't know, Mike. I don't know, because I was raised in the Bahamas. I spent time in the U.S., but I've also been elected to different societies in the U.K. So like Royal Society of Biology, Royal Society of Chemistry. I had some progress in terms of enlisted in the directory, in the professional development program for chartered chemists with the Royal Society of Chemistry. And I have some things pending with Royal Society of Biology in the UK. I'm not sure. All I can say is I'm open to what God's will is for me. What that will look like, I'm not sure yet. I'm still figuring that piece out. But I know that Scripture says if you acknowledge Him in your ways, He'll direct your path, or He'll make your path straight. So I'm in for the journey. But I think moments like this allow me to reflect and kind of gain some more perspective to potentially narrow the aperture of my decisions.
Well, I can't argue with your reasoning there. I'm fully on board with that. We'll see where God leads you. Yep. And I know you'll do great things. Just one closing question, unless you have any other things you want to address. Kind of looping back to the podcast, we've learned about you again, and maybe this will inform your answer to this question. Is there anyone who you really want to be on the podcast you've not been able to get yet, or maybe you think they're out of reach, or you think, I don't know, there's some barrier in the way of them coming to the podcast? Is there someone that you really, really would like to interview for the New Chemist podcast?
Yes, there is. My dad. I would like to interview my dad. My dad is very busy, but I just have to find the time for us to both. He already agreed to be on it. Just to find the time and then he recently became a pastor too. So he's not only a practicing physician, but he recently became a senior pastor of one of the local churches on the island. So he's very busy. But I think I like about my dad is he never is too busy to take a call. Both my parents, they're never too busy to take a call from me. So the next person, I think for the 300th episode. So I've completed about 299 episodes for this podcast over the 5-year span, and I'm about to do episode 300. Actually, this is going to be the 300th episode, but for the episode 301, when I cut my teeth in that space, I would like to interview all of my relatives. I think they can speak to what it takes to persevere past tremendous challenges, and I think they'll add a level of gravity to the podcast that I think that they bring in their own lived experiences. So that's the person who I want to interview next. Of course, my brother, but he's a lawyer, so I don't know if he's gonna want to come on the science podcast. But I was able to get my sister on the podcast. I know it's kind of humorous. It's actually my family member, so I like to see him on the podcast. It's just a matter of coordinating the time, because everyone's just trying to get their own progress done. So yeah, man, my dad is the next person who I'd like to have. So I'm grateful for this conversation, but my dad is the next person who I'd like to have, quite frankly.
Okay, I think that's also a pretty good answer.
Yeah.
Definitely look forward to hearing that one in the future.
I know, right? Board certified pediatric physician who persevered through a tremendous challenge. Farmers growing up, lots of challenges. Of course, he had to support a family, but he worked in high school. He worked in high school, worked while he was in college. He started working. I'll just share a little bit of the story, and then I'll let us wrap up. He started working as a parking boy, so he parked groceries at one of this food store chain in Nassau and Providence that he worked at. Was super valued, so he parked groceries from when he was like 11, and then he worked his way up to being a butcher, and then he saved enough money to go to the College of the Bahamas, which is now the University of the Bahamas. And after that, he got the opportunity, he got a scholarship to go to Taylor University, which is the university that both my brother, my mother, and I went to for a while. And after that, he was able to work at EdTech, save up enough money to go to med school, went to med school, then went to one of the top residency programs in the US for pediatrics, and then proceeded to complete his residency and went back home, Bahamas, to work and help, and he's been working as a physician in the Bahamas from 1999 to now. So I think, having some more of those stories, I think it will be enjoyable and also meaningful for a lot of the audience. So I think, I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, Mike, I am so grateful. This is a treat. This is a treat to have this conversation. So I'll let you wrap up.
Yeah, again, a treat for me too. I'm glad that the viewers will get to hear some, more commentary directly from you, since you usually do a very good job centering, the topic around the guest. So I think it's a great thing that you get to be the guest on your own podcast at least once in a while. You get to share some of the cool things that are going on in the development of the podcast and in your life in particular too. And who knows, maybe in 20 years someone will have a similar podcast and you'll get to be a guest on their podcast also. So who knows where our paths will lead us.
Who knows, man. Thanks. And also I have to drop this in. Mike is currently a postdoc at UPenn, so definitely good that you're able to make time for it. So yeah, dude, take it easy, Mike.
Yeah, take it easy. Nice chatting, David. See you.
Yep.
Welcome to the podcast series The New Student Pharmacist, where we discuss chemistry and pharmacy, as well as leaders in pharmacy careers, community, and chemistry and pharmacy research. We encourage you to support the work we are doing and follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts by subscribing for free. Note, The views on the podcast represent those of my guest and I.
Purpose of these episodes not at all for advice or medical suggestions. These are aimed to provide support to peer pharmacists in training in educational and intellectually stimulating ways. Again, these are not at all for medical advice or medical suggestions. Please see your local board and state-certified health professional. The views of this podcast represent those of my guests and I.
All right, let's talk about a general method to tackle complex pharmacokinetic problems. We'll walk through a step-by-step approach, making sure each part makes sense as we go. First, it's important to identify patient-specific parameters. These include the ideal body weight, or IBW, the adjusted body weight for obese patients, known as ABW, creatinine clearance, or CRCL, the volume of distribution, which we call VD, and finally, clearance, or CL. Next, you'll want to calculate key pharmacokinetic parameters. The elimination rate constant, K, is calculated as clearance divided by volume of distribution, or CL over VD. The half-life, T1/2, is found by dividing 0.693 by K. Now for some tips on dosing gentamicin or tobramycin. To begin the pharmacokinetic dosing process, first calculate the patient's ideal body weight. If the patient is significantly overweight, meaning more than 120% of their ideal body weight, you'll need to calculate their adjusted body weight. Next, determine the patient's creatinine clearance using the Cockcroft-Gault equation to evaluate renal function. After assessing renal function, calculate the drug's volume of distribution, typically starting with a baseline of 0.25 liters per kilogram multiplied by IBW, and add 0.1 liters per kilogram for any excess body weight if needed. With the estimated creatinine clearance, calculate the gentamicin or tobramycin clearance by multiplying 0.06 by the creatinine clearance. Use the clearance and volume of distribution values to calculate the elimination rate constant, which is clearance divided by volume of distribution, and then derive the half-life by dividing 0.693 by K. Using the target peak concentration and volume of distribution, calculate an initial dose. After the patient reaches steady state, make sure to measure actual peak and trough levels. Finally, adjust the dosage or dosing interval as needed, using pharmacokinetic equations to meet the desired therapeutic peak and trough targets. All right, so to begin dosing vancomycin, you'll want to first estimate the patient's creatinine clearance using the Cockcroft-Gault equation. After that, calculate the patient's specific vancomycin clearance with the formula clearance equals 0.689 times creatinine clearance, plus 3.66. Next, determine the volume of distribution, which is usually 0.7 liters per kilogram multiplied by the total body weight. With these parameters, you can calculate the elimination rate constant, which is clearance divided by volume of distribution, and then figure out the drug's half-life using 0.693 divided by that rate constant. Use the desired steady-state trough concentration to calculate an appropriate initial vancomycin dosing regimen, applying the pharmacokinetic dosing equation that involves the dosing interval, target concentration, and elimination rate constant. Once the patient reaches steady state, you'll need to measure actual trough concentrations. Based on these measured trough levels, or the desired AUC to MIC ratios, adjust the dosage or dosing intervals to make sure you're hitting that therapeutic efficacy and safety. For digoxin dosing, you'll want to first estimate the patient's creatinine clearance using the Cockcroft-Gault equation to determine renal clearance. Based on renal function, calculate the digoxin clearance. Next, estimate the volume of distribution, which is commonly around 7 liters per kilogram. But keep in mind, this might vary a bit based on patient characteristics. Use these values to calculate the appropriate initial loading dose, using the formula loading dose equals desired concentration times volume of distribution, divided by bioavailability. After that, calculate the maintenance dose by applying the clearance, desired steady-state concentration, dosing interval, and bioavailability. At steady state, measure the digoxin concentration in plasma, and then adjust maintenance doses as needed to achieve and maintain therapeutic concentration ranges, which really helps minimize the risk of toxicity. For procainamide and its active metabolite N-acetylprocainamide, or NAPA, start by calculating the patient's creatinine clearance using the Cockcroft-Gault formula, since evaluating renal function is essential for both drugs. Use creatinine clearance to calculate procainamide and NAPA clearance, making sure to account for both renal and hepatic components as needed. Next, estimate the volume of distribution for procainamide, which is generally around 2 liters per kilogram. Calculate the appropriate intravenous loading dose to achieve your desired therapeutic concentrations, using the formula loading dose equals target concentration times volume of distribution. Then, determine the appropriate maintenance infusion rate using procainamide clearance and the desired steady-state concentration, with the formula infusion rate equals clearance times desired concentration. At steady state, measure both procainamide and NAPA plasma concentrations, and then adjust dosing or infusion rates based on these concentrations to achieve therapeutic effectiveness while avoiding toxicity. When dosing methotrexate, begin by estimating the patient's creatinine clearance using the Cockcroft-Gault equation, which will help guide your renal clearance estimates. From population estimates or any patient-specific data you might have, calculate methotrexate clearance. Using the target methotrexate plasma concentration, determine the necessary infusion rate with the relationship infusion rate equals target steady-state concentration times clearance. After administration, you'll want to regularly measure methotrexate plasma levels at predetermined intervals. Based on these plasma concentrations, make any necessary adjustments, including modifying dosing schedules or adding or adjusting leucovorin rescue therapy to effectively manage therapeutic goals and prevent adverse toxicity associated with methotrexate. To approach lithium pharmacokinetics, start by assessing the patient's renal function, usually by calculating creatinine clearance with the Cockcroft-Gault equation. Renal clearance has a direct impact on lithium clearance, since lithium is primarily eliminated unchanged by the kidneys. Estimate lithium clearance using the relationship based on renal function, which is often approximated as lithium clearance equals 0.25 times creatinine clearance. Determine the appropriate volume of distribution for lithium, which is usually around 0.7 liters per kilogram based on the patient's total body weight. With these parameters, calculate the elimination rate constant, which is clearance divided by volume of distribution, and then the half-life, which is 0.693 divided by the elimination rate constant. Calculate the initial lithium dose needed to achieve your desired steady-state concentration using standard pharmacokinetic dosing equations. Dose equals target concentration times clearance times dosing interval. After starting therapy, measure serum lithium levels at steady state, which usually happens about 4 to 5 half-lives after initiation or any dosage adjustment. Based on these measured serum levels, carefully adjust lithium doses or dosing intervals, taking into account factors like changes in renal function, drug interactions, patient hydration status, and toxicity risk to maintain therapeutic concentrations, typically ranging from 0.6 to 1.2 milliequivalents per liter.
Purpose of these episodes not at all for advice or medical suggestions. These are aimed to provide support to peer pharmacists in training in educational and intellectually stimulating ways. Again, these are not at all for medical advice or medical suggestions. Please see your local board and state-certified health professional. The views of this podcast represent those of my guests and I.
Thanks for listening. We're glad you were able to tune into this podcast. Once again, this is the New Chemist, where we discuss chemistry, which simply put is the science of change, as well as the other sciences, careers, community, research, and COVID-19. Thanks again for listening. Note, the views on this podcast represent those of my guests and I.